Welcome. My name is Ben Lieberman, and I'm a senior fellow at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, a free market think tank located here in Washington, D.C. And today's discussion is entitled Restrictions on Federal Oil and Gas Activity, Implications for the Permian Basin and Beyond. And I'm pleased to be joined by Garrett Golding, business economist with the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas, and Kathleen Sgamma, president of the Western Energy Alliance. And let me say at the outset that if you have any questions at any time, please send them along either using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen or email them to us at events@cei.org. Now, for those of you who follow energy and related climate issues, the first 4 months of the Biden administration have been like drinking out of a fire hose. There's so much change that has been put in play, all in the direction of placing additional restrictions on the production, transport, and use of fossil fuels. But the one measure that's had the most direct and immediate impact has been the January suspension of new leasing activity, oil and gas leasing activity on federal lands. Now, as far as the wisdom of this policy, I'm reminded of the old adage that when good news comes knocking, you should open the door. Well, this nation certainly got good news in the form of the shale revolution about a decade or so ago. How soon we forget that for the longest time, really from the 1973 Arab oil embargo until about a decade ago, the dominant theme in energy policy was one of scarcity, of peak oil, of unavoidable declines in domestic oil production and increases in dependence on foreign sources of oil, many of which were nations hostile to American interests. I mean, that was essentially the energy debate for nearly a generation. But that whole paradigm was shattered, and it was shattered by tremendous American innovations in things like hydraulic fracturing, horizontal drilling, and others that unlocked vast amounts of oil and gas here in the US. And we as a nation has reaped tremendous benefits over the last decade. In fact, one wonders what the economy would have looked like over the last 10 years had it not been for the shale revolution. Now, the Permian Basin is arguably the ground zero for both the shale revolution and the threats to it that we now see from the restrictions on leasing activity. It's America's and the world's largest shale oil and gas field. And because it encompasses parts of Texas and New Mexico, it makes for an interesting test case for the Biden policy. The reason for that is that quite a bit of the land on the New Mexico side, maybe as much as half of the energy-rich lands, are federal lands and thus are subject to the leasing restrictions, while nearly all the land on the Texas side is not subject to these restrictions. It may be subject to other things that will come along, but not to the oil and gas leasing suspension. And so this raises a number of interesting questions. What will be the impact on oil production on the New Mexico side? To what extent can Texas take up the slack through additional production on its non-federal lands? What are the implications for state revenues and for jobs? What are the environmental implications, both good and bad? And what are the impacts on the nation as a whole? And so with that, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Garrett Golding. Garrett is a business economist with the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas. And for those of you who don't know, the Dallas Fed has long had an excellent research arm, and Garrett is a part of that. And in fact, he published a paper, co-authored a paper with Kunal Patel on this topic in March of this year, which I included as a link to the invitation. Now, before coming to the Dallas Fed, Garrett was an energy analyst with the Rapidan Group. I think headed up the Texas office. And before that, I had the privilege of working alongside Garrett when we were young or relatively young staffers on the House Energy and Commerce Committee under then Chairman Fred Upton, and worked on issues like trying to get approval for the Keystone XL pipeline, trying to pass the Energy Tax Prevention Act, which would have precluded EPA from regulating greenhouse gases as such. And we were also there as the paradigm shift from scarcity to abundance was beginning to percolate up to the Hill. So with that, I'll hand things over to Garrett.
Sure, thank you, Ben. And want to make sure that my screen is showing here. Is it ready for you all? Okay, great. So yeah, thank you for the invitation. And I have to say from the outset, get into why we did this study, but from the beginning, there's a disclaimer. I have to say that the views that we're discussing here are my own and that of my co-author, Kunal Patel, not necessarily that of the Dallas Fed or the Federal Reserve System. So, why did we do this study? Every Federal Reserve Bank, which there are 12 of across the U.S., we're really listening post for the regional economy, and that's what feeds into our analysis that ultimately goes into FOMC decisions. And our research department, which is about 36 economists, all have different specializations, and we're the only reserve bank in the system that has an energy team that focuses exclusively on oil and gas industry and the energy transition. So reserve banks usually do not wade into political or policy issues or questions that are for lawmakers or policymakers to answer. But when it came to this one, we made the decision that this is something we need to look into and not necessarily make a judgment call or say whether or not this is a good or bad idea, but we needed to have, contribute in some way to the discussion on this topic because the Permian Basin is a major economic driver in the 11th Federal Reserve District. As Ben said, the most important shale oil basin in the world. This was an interesting case of looking at how it impacts two different states that are in our district. So the way that we went about this was initially, we had to understand what exactly these executive orders were saying. There was a lot of confusion, I think, in the media and some of the trade press on what exactly they did or did not do, and ultimately what the long-term implications of these announcements would be regarding possible regulations in the future. So to get a better grasp of this, we reached out across a pretty broad swath of our contacts throughout the industry, through different government agencies to environmental groups, everyone who is a stakeholder in this process, to try to understand what their reaction to the executive orders were and how they see things proceeding going forward. So because when we were trying to develop our production model and ultimately what would flow out of that for the economic impacts, we had to come up with some scenarios for what regulations would look like, even though we didn't actually have regulations in February and March when we were doing this. We also had to, come up with how different exploration companies were responding to this. We were hearing stories, some that had acreage in both New Mexico and Texas were saying, we're packing up and we're leaving New Mexico right now. And we were hearing stories, whether or not they were true or not, of trucks turning around, and heading back to Texas. And we were hearing other operators that said, look, we're going to hit the gas in New Mexico. We're going to drill as fast as we can, to use up the permits that we have. And I'm sure Kathleen will speak about this, but there was quite a big, buildup of inventory of these drilling permits and leasing over the last 2 years in anticipation of more stringent regulations coming down in the future. So there's a big bank of permits out there. Some operators said we're going to go through them pretty fast over the next year or so before whatever happens next happens. So that made forecasting for us rather difficult, trying to come up with really what we call it, trying to hit the fairway on where the possible activity levels could shake out over the next few years. And so, looking at the Permian Basin, we have really three different subbasins, the Midland Central Basin and the Delaware Basin. As far as shale production goes, it's really the Midland and Delaware that we're most interested in and that we model internally at the Dallas Fed for our own forecast. And within this picture, you're looking at a pretty stark difference between how federal regulations are going to impact the basin. roughly half of New Mexico's oil production and half of field activity is coming on federal property in that southeast corner of the state. That acreage is generally more productive, has better well results than what we see on average throughout the Midland Basin. But they also are gassier, and that creates some infrastructure questions as well for operators. It's also, by and large, a cheaper operating environment as far as royalty rates are concerned compared to across the border. But the operators that we spoke with said that, this is primarily something that they deal with, that they will take this higher productivity in exchange for the longer permitting times, the more of the headache that's associated with a greater barrier to entry for permitting than what you have in the state of Texas. So that led to us having three scenarios to evaluate here. One was a reference case, which shouldn't be construed as a base case or something that is our projection of where the basin is going, but it was something to base these other regulatory scenarios against. So the reference case assumed that the activity levels we were seeing in the first quarter of this year continued. Through the end of the forecast period, which went through the end of 2025. Under that case, we saw the Permian Basin continuing to increase by about 1.5 million barrels over that period. Now, this is probably a much different outlook than what we were looking at 2 years ago. And this isn't even about COVID. This is about the behavior of the industry over the last 2 years, where the industry has put much greater emphasis on returning cash to shareholders in the form of dividends or stock buybacks, and not pursuing as aggressive of production targets as we've seen. A lot of companies are looking at 10, 20% production increases year over year in the Permian Basin. Now it's generally a single digit game that they're playing in order to not spend as much CapEx, not create any more debt, pay down their debt, return money to shareholders, generate free cash flow. So it is a much slower activity pace that we're looking at in the Permian Basin going forward. And that is also what filtered into our regulatory scenarios. So the first one that we looked at was what we called the hybrid scenario. The hybrid was, we assumed based on conversations with the stakeholders that there will be no more new leasing on federal property. We did not consider it a case where leasing continues at the pace that we've seen over the last few years. So under the hybrid case, there's no new leasing, but current leaseholders are able to obtain extensions on permits that may expire. Generally, these permits last 2 years. We assume that producers will continue to be able to drill the acreage that they hold throughout the forecast period. Under the restrictive case, we assume that there are no extensions of those permits, and obviously no new permits issued on leasehold that does not currently have a permit to drill. And so what this led to was, we didn't really know what the answer would be when we started to do this study, but rather to our surprise, we still saw the Permian Basin growing throughout even the restrictive scenario. But if you look under the hood, it's a much different story when you're dealing with state by state. So in New Mexico, which was producing a little over a million barrels a day at the end of last year, under the reference case, it was continuing to grow to about 1.5 million. However, under this restrictive case, it starts to peak and roll over relatively quickly before the end of this year. Because the amount of permits that are out there just are not able to keep pace with the decline curve that we see in the Delaware Basin. Under the restrictive case, it keeps falling throughout the forecast period, and it misses the mark by about 800,000 barrels a day from where it would be otherwise. Conversely, these scenarios are flipped in the state of Texas, where we expect that producers will start to move their rigs and completion crews across the border where they can and where they're able. Obviously, there's not an unlimited amount of acreage out here, nor is there an unlimited amount of top-tier acreage left going throughout the forecast period. But what's interesting is the worse that things appear for New Mexico, the better they appear to get for Texas as far as production forecasts go. However, it does look like a worse deal for New Mexico on production volumes than it is as a good deal for Texas in the future. So the other findings that we saw is, on the job impacts, we limited our research just to the direct rig and frac crew piece, and again, we're seeing an uptick in jobs on this level versus what we see in New Mexico, which the more interesting story, but one that we didn't really have the time to get into, nor do we think we could have it predicted with any real accuracy, are the associated indirect jobs, which we just assume are going to be much higher than these numbers and would be going in the same direction for these states. The other interesting part of this, obviously, is related to state revenue. New Mexico received $809 million in federal royalties. There's a much higher number than that related to direct taxes and fees on the industry that's directly correlated to field activity in the state of New Mexico. We see how in there, we didn't make a projection on what those revenues would look like, partly because we expect that royalty rates would change on federal land. And that's a big question. How much would federal royalty rates being increased help offset the lower activity pace? That may be something that we'll look into whenever we have figures on that. But under the restrictive case, obviously, New Mexico state revenue is going to suffer, but perhaps dramatically, by losing out on the revenue that they've seen over the last several years. Under the restrictive case, there is a possibility that it would start to level out at a certain level based on the production forecast that we saw. On the downstream end, huge investment on the Gulf Coast over the last several years to take light and super light crude from this basin under the expectation that it would continue growing. If that doesn't happen, then there would be imports primarily from West Africa, the Arabian Gulf, to replace those light and super light volumes. And the export market that these volumes are being sent to from the Permian Basin would be replaced from competitors in those foreign markets as well. An interesting wrinkle that we didn't get into in the study, but one that we assume will happen, is because there are much fewer, if any, flaring restrictions in the state of Texas, and there are much more stringent in incoming regulations on this in New Mexico, that as production shifts into the state of Texas, you may actually see a net positive increase in flaring pollution in the basin due to that shift across the border. On other environmental impacts, we estimate there are about 1,200 heavy truck trips for every 3-well pad in the Permian Basin. As that activity switches from New Mexico to Texas, you would see a much higher level of on-road traffic and the damage that it creates. Having spent some time out there, this is a persistent complaint among residents in the industry that the road maintenance is just not able to keep up with what these trucks do. So, again, something we couldn't really have the space for under the 1,000-word limit of our blog piece, but something that, we try to speak about whenever we have the opportunity to present this publicly. So with that, if you all have any questions for me later in this, obviously we're about to get into that after Kathleen, or if you want to reach out to me personally, happy to do that as well.
Okay, well, thank you, Garrett. Our next speaker is Kathleen Sgamma, president of the Western Energy Alliance, which represents 200 mostly small businesses operating in the oil and gas sector throughout the Rocky Mountain West. So a perspective that includes the Permian Basin, but elsewhere as well. Kathleen recently testified before the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee on many of these topics, and a link to her testimony was included with the invitation. So with that, I'll hand things over to Kathleen.
Thanks, Ben. I really appreciate being here today, and it's an honor to be here with Garrett as well. And really appreciate that his study came out. Like Ben said, Western Energy Alliance represents producers all across the West. So obviously, Intermountain West includes New Mexico, Utah, Colorado, Wyoming, North Dakota. So we've been taking it from that regional standpoint. And So I don't have a study to present or anything, although I have been using a study out of Wyoming. The Wyoming Energy Authority did a study looking at the impact of the leasing ban and a leasing and drilling ban. So it has kind of similar to Garrett's hybrid scenario and the restrictive scenario. But that study looked at the impact in the 8 states that have over 97% of federal oil and natural gas production. And I'd like to emphasize that my comments will be focused on the ban onshore, since I do represent a landlocked region, but the offshore piece is concerning as well. But my numbers don't include that. And just looking at the impacts from the leasing ban alone, not we had anticipated back last fall that there could have been a leasing ban, or there could have been a complete ban. Who knows how far the Biden administration was going to go. Now, they did choose the leasing ban, I guess, because it sounded more moderate, but I think we'll get into how that leasing ban on new leases quickly affects existing leases as well. But anyway, if you look at the economic impacts in the West from this leasing ban, by the end of Biden's term, it will have killed $33.5 billion of GDP, 58,000 jobs annually by year 4, $0.3 billion in state revenues. And, it's just got enormous economic impacts. And that's because, yes, it's a ban on federal leasing, but because of the interspersed nature of land ownership, land and mineral ownership in the West, a ban on federal lands quickly spills over to non-federal, private, state, tribal, Indian Alati lands. So there will be economic impacts. And that's why that economist who's out of the University of Wyoming found such a large economic impact from a leasing ban alone. So those are the numbers we've been using. I love the specificity on the Permian Basin because it illustrates in microcosm what happens from federal to non-federal lands. And it's kind of a bigger microcosm, right? Because it's from the state of New Mexico to the state of Texas. The state of Texas certainly benefits from New Mexico's development being limited. But, as Garrett points out in his report as well, some of the prime areas in the Permian are indeed on federal lands. So, we are taking that off limits to the benefit of the American people. Taking that benefit off limits means that some of that production just can't shift to Texas because you can't force the oil to migrate over, right? Well, maybe over geological time periods you could. So we have not developed a long enough lateral yet to go from Texas all over the West, so we don't have to deal with federal lands issues. But seriously, that points out to one of the ways that this ban on new leasing affects existing leasing. You'll see that in the Permian certainly, but you see it a lot in the Bakken and North Dakota as well, which is try as you might to site your well on non-federal lands, primarily tapping into private or state or tribal minerals. At some point, your 1 or 2 mile lateral is going to touch a pocket of federal minerals. And as soon as you determine that that well is going to touch a pocket of federal minerals, you have to get a new lease to develop that well. So quickly, a ban on new leases can impact existing leases as well. So I'm going to leave it there so we have plenty of time for discussion, but actually I won't leave it there. Just give me 1 more minute. Because of these impacts, Western Energy Alliance was prepared immediately when President Biden signed the order, and within minutes, we had filed a lawsuit in the state of Wyoming challenging this leasing ban, because the Mineral Leasing Act is clear. The Interior Secretary shall hold quarterly lease sales in states where there's interest, and there is certainly plenty of interest in leasing federal lands in the Permian, in the Powder River of Wyoming, in the Bakken in North Dakota, and all across the West. So I look forward to the discussion, and thanks a lot, Ben.
Okay, well, thank you, Kathleen. And remember, you can submit questions either using the Q&A box or sending an email to events@cei.org. The first question is the one that Kathleen just answered, but if you want to add a little more to it, what is the status of the litigation? Again, the Mineral Leasing Act sets up a leasing program. The Biden administration is essentially saying, we're concerned that none of this is in the interest of the American people. So we're taking a programmatic look at all leasing, and they've suspended everything. So there are questions about whether the Mineral Leasing Act and other statutes have been violated. Do you want to add anything about the status of the litigation?
Sure. And to that point, I don't know how 8 and 9% of our oil and natural gas production coming from federal lands is not a benefit to the American people. And overall, $9 billion that's returned to the Treasury from onshore and offshore natural gas and oil is not a benefit to the American people. But we could probably get into that as well. So we filed suit. Wyoming filed suit also in Wyoming, maybe a month after. And just at the beginning of the month, Wyoming filed a motion for preliminary injunction. So that was very encouraging. We as an industry probably didn't have a case to be made that we have immediate irreparable harm from the new leasing ban, because we do have existing leases. But the state of Wyoming could really make a case of immediate irreparable harm from the ban, because they just canceled the first and second quarter lease sales this year. And every lease sale, Wyoming returns millions of dollars from the sale of oil and natural gas leases. So they are able to show an immediate harm. We are going through briefing now for that preliminary injunction. I think that will be done in mid to late June. And I'm not sure if the judge is going to want to schedule oral arguments around that time, but we could find out pretty soon being, maybe beginning of July, whether the judge will will force BLM to move forward with first and second quarter lease sales, at least in Wyoming, as a result of that preliminary injunction. I really like our chances in court in general. I think, maybe we can see ruling on the merits of the case overall by the end of the year, because the Mineral Leasing Act is really simple. It says the Interior Secretary shall hold quarterly lease sales. So it is not within the power of the president to just say, hey, we're going to stop all lease sales. And I like the way Wyoming in their preliminary injunction described it as, shoot first, ask questions later. And that's exactly what happened. And I think it helps strengthen our case in court, which is they banned leasing, but they still don't have a plan on what they're doing. So the ostensible reason for banning leasing was, it was just going to be a pause to study comprehensively the entire onshore and offshore oil and natural gas system. Well, anytime the Bureau of Land Management does an environmental impact statement for oil and natural gas, it takes years. So that's why we're assuming it's going to take basically the whole first term. And it's going to be this comprehensive analysis. It's going to look at climate change impacts from wellhead to burner tip, to end use consumption. And that's going to be a long type of programmatic NEPA analysis. That doesn't take, a few months. That's not a short pause. So we'll see what that is going to look like, but right now they don't have a plan.
Okay. I've also seen a few questions about methane and possibly regulations based on the social cost of methane and how that might affect operations. Do either of you want to respond to that?
Yeah, we haven't done anything on that, no.
Sure, yeah. I mean, it's clear that the Biden administration wants to do methane rules. It's certainly within their authority under the Clean Air Act to do some regulation on methane. That will take some time. To go through that whole process. I would just, would like to take issue with your characterization, Garrett, of flaring as flaring pollution, because flaring is an air control device. I mean, it's a method to control air emissions. So you flare the gas instead of venting it, because the direct venting has more climate change impact, right? So when you burn off in a flare, you're not only burning off the methane, but you're also burning off most of the pollutants. So it is certainly, there's still some CO2, some NOx that comes off of that flare, but it is much reduced because it is a pollution control device as well. But, methane is a big topic. New Mexico, other states, the federal government are all working to reduce methane through regulation. Companies have largely taken on voluntary efforts or just naturally capture their methane because it's a product that we sell. So there's a lot of activity in that space, which I guess we could go into. The social cost of carbon, that is in a rulemaking right now. CEI has way more expertise in that than I do with all that's wrong with the social cost of carbon calculations, but we will be certainly commenting in that space as well.
Okay, well, here's maybe more of a political question. Is there any chance that the Biden administration might back off? For example, in New Mexico, we see some bipartisan concern about the policy.
I'm happy to go first. I don't want to monopolize the conversation. Okay, so, there is a chance. They still haven't announced their plan on how they're going to do this review of the entire onshore oil and gas program. They have gotten pushback from the governor of New Mexico, both senators, even the Western Governors Association has pushed back on them. They have gotten a lot of bipartisan concern because of the funding. I mean, a third of New Mexico's budget, a third of New Mexico's state education funding comes from oil and gas. So there's a real concern about this ban on, the viability of New Mexico's budget and infrastructure and all the things that budget funds. So there is pushback that could, since they haven't released a plan, perhaps that pushback is making them have second thoughts. Well, maybe we don't need to do a years long analysis. Maybe we can, do something a little bit quicker, get that out sooner, move forward, not get into the environmental group's wish list of completely analyzing oil and natural gas permitting off all existing leases. Maybe we can back off on some of this, come out with something quick, and then move forward. So they do have wiggle room right now because a plan is not released.
Okay, here's one possibly for Garrett, that the environmental impacts of the suspension are mixed. That the land won't be disturbed, and there won't be any emissions from the production activity. But on the other hand, this is also slowing down some of the projects that could help preclude flaring, which we've talked about. There's also the fact that some of the revenues would go to environmental projects under the Great Outdoors Act. Of course, whether the Great Outdoors Act is so great, that's a topic for another day. But could you talk a little bit about maybe the mixed impacts that maybe weren't fully considered when the suspension on new leasing and permitting was announced?
Yeah. So the way we understood it was, the temporary permitting pause. I mean, what got all the attention were drilling permits, but there were routine permits that needed, updates, or, they were just kind of routine things that went well beyond just drilling permits, whether they were pipeline rights of way, or you needed something to hook up, your takeaway capacity, gathering lines. There are a lot of different things that trip off federal, this federal review process that, made things very complicated for a lot of producers for a period of time. I do not know how much of that has been cleared up since the 60-day period ended a while back. And this authority was given back to the regional BLM offices. I assume Kathleen could speak to that. But when an operator can't hook up their gathering system, on one hand, it's a possible safety issue. So, and on the other, they've got to flare as a result of that if they aren't able to hook up to the gas takeaway. So, there was that from what we were hearing on the ground from folks. And what we were, what I was touching on earlier on, as it relates to the broader impact here. I guess you would see less development on these federal lands going forward forward, but the net impact, as far as air and flaring pollution goes, is, these companies are going to have to shift where they can into the state of Texas or elsewhere in New Mexico, if that's possible for some of them. Now, obviously, a lot of them are very heavily levered in New Mexico and may not be able to make that adaptation. But the ones that are going to go into Texas, where there is not really anything in the way of flaring restrictions from the Railroad Commission, and we assume probably will not be for some time. And the only thing that we're relying on as far as seeing, a rollover in flaring volumes is this lower activity pace than what we were seeing a couple of years ago. The main problem, the main cause of flaring was, wells being drilled outside of the reach of gas gathering systems, or that there wasn't enough gas transmission capable of taking it off, even if they were able to hook it up. Those problems have seemed to kind of work themselves out in Texas. We're not facing the kind of capacity constraints that we were seeing in the transmission systems going to the Gulf Coast and to the west that we were seeing 2 or 3 years ago. So, there is that, but at the same time, flaring is a pretty regular process out here for many producers that, we hope we see this being worked out just from a business practice perspective, and some of the other, pressures that are coming on the industry, be it ESG or whatever it may be from the investor community. But the fact of the day is still that there are no serious regulations against it in the state of Texas. And as you shift production here from New Mexico, you would see, we assume, more flaring.
Okay, well, one more question for either of you. The role of Indian tribes, ones that are producing energy or ones that benefit from the jobs and the tax revenues that come to some of these communities in the rural West. How are Indian tribes impacted by the executive order?
That was something that the Ute tribe in Utah did a really good job. As soon as the original, the day one 60-day ban on new permitting and leasing went into effect, the Ute tribe wrote a letter and pointed out that this does not impact Indian tribes, because tribes' lands are managed to a different standard than our federal lands. Tribal land is not federal land. It is to be used to the benefit of the tribes solely, not for environmental uses or other uses and other, it just doesn't have those same types of restrictions. So when the president's order came out, they were wise to highlight that this order did not apply to tribal lands. The problem is tribal lands and Indian Alati lands are interspersed with federal lands all over the place in the West. So certainly a large contiguous block of federal or tribal lands on the Navajo reservation or up in the 3 affiliated tribes up in North Dakota is fine. But those tribal lands that are at the edges or that are interspersed with federal lands will be definitely impacted, because again, with the horizontal drilling, you can't just, you're not doing one vertical well into one little patch of lands. If you can't put together a leasehold that is long enough to accommodate your lateral, then you're just not going to drill that well. So if you happen to have tribal lands that, are adjacent to federal lands, then, some of those wells, some of those Indian minerals just are not going to be developed because you can't get a new federal permit. Now, obviously, if you have an existing one, you could, but it will impact tribes. And that's why the University of Wyoming economists found spillover effects all across the West.
I'm getting a few questions about fracking, which in one sense is more narrow. That's just one way of producing the energy, although on many of these lands, it's the only economic way, whereas the suspension applies to leasing no matter what method would be used. But did any of you want to talk about the potential for Bureau of Land Management targeting fracking?
We won a case back in 2015 that was a clear stop to federal BLM regulation of fracking. Fracking regulation resides with the states. And, I suppose BLM could try to do a new fracking rule. They would be unwise to do so. I think they're going down a more fruitful path for them by concentrating on methane. This administration concentrating on methane will be much more effective than trying to do another round of fracking regulation. The banning fracking was clearly not politically viable to President Biden when he was a candidate. He promised he wasn't going to ban fracking because he wanted to win Pennsylvania. I just don't see it as really a fruitful method. He decided he was going to concentrate on federal lands. He was going to make it more difficult. And ultimately, if they go the full route and do a full analysis, they will make permitting on existing leases difficult, if not impossible. So that is the end goal. It's to get rid of development on federal lands. I think that's where they're focused. So the fracking piece of it is not that interesting, I think, anymore. But certainly, every well in the West is fracked. It's just.
And I would add, in both of our studies, well, both of our scenarios, primarily the hybrid one, we did assume a slower permitting pace for the federal property. We don't know, what it looks like, or how long, to the day, how these permits will take to obtain, but we had to assume it would be different from what we have seen. So that was something we anticipated going forward.
Yeah, well, I mean, they said this, it's right in the order. The pause is to look at all aspects of federal production and development, including permitting and leasing. So this ban on new leasing is a way to constrain, if not get rid of completely, any development on existing leases. Now, we, of course, reserve the right, our litigation right now is on the leasing ban. Were they to try to ban permitting completely, that's another lawsuit, and we'll be right there on that. There's no question. Without some major act of Congress, which does not seem at all likely in this divided Congress or in future equally divided Congresses, it's just not really viable for them to try to stop development on existing leases.
Okay, this one's for Garrett. Is the Texas Railroad Commission considering any new flaring rules that you're aware of?
Not that I'm aware of. The latest thing that they did sometime last year was, what happens is you have to get a permit to flare from the Railroad Commission, and it's kind of just been that they just grant them. They started to require more data from the applicant over why exactly they need this. They need permission to flare. It didn't really leave a higher level of, or threshold for which the applicant needs to meet to get the permit, but it was a step in the direction of seeing, Railroad Commission's been, I think, under a fair amount of public pressure to do something on flaring for the last couple of years. And it was a step in that direction, I guess you could say, but there doesn't appear to be anything, on, the docket. And granted, I don't, look at what they're doing every day, but from what we understand, these commissioners are not really looking to get that aggressive on it in the near term, even though they are speaking more about it than I think they ever have over the last few months.
If I might add, I mean, there's certainly a lot of pressure on industry to reduce flaring. There is quite a bit of activity. API has the environmental partnership, and many companies have signed on board and are working to reduce flaring rates and increase gas capture rates. Garrett's already mentioned the shareholder pressure. So companies are doing things. They don't need regulation to tell them to reduce their flaring because they're getting pressure internally and from shareholders. So it's not as if there's nothing going on in Texas in that regard, although I don't have any insight on I know Texoga, the association there, is working on reducing flaring as well.
Yeah, and there's kind of, some other market reasons for what's going on right now. When larger companies come into and start a development plan, they're able to pretty effectively coordinate with the midstream operators to get the gathering systems and transmission lines all lined up so that when they're drilling wells, they have something to connect the gas to. For a lot of the smaller, private equity backed or, some of the small cap public companies, they may not have that luxury. They don't really have the inertia to throw weight around with the midstream companies on these contracts. And they're also drilling generally, some fringier assets that, there probably wouldn't be gas transmission hooked up to anyway. But what's happening over the last couple of years is, or really the last year, you're seeing a lot of industry consolidation. You're seeing bigger companies get bigger. You're seeing smaller companies that have either gone bankrupt or been absorbed, or been, on the private equity level, portfolio companies that are being put together into larger single entities. And so what that says to me is that, this one cause of, I think, the high flaring volumes has been the type of operators that are out there, and there's fewer of them that are more prone to flare than some of these larger ones that have the ability to get their infrastructure lined up ahead of time.
Yeah, although I would mention that, it really depends on the company. I don't want to throw small companies under the bus because a lot of small companies are doing really well in this space and have flaring rates that are quite comparable to some of the larger companies too. So.
And even some large companies had really high rates, until recently. So.
Okay, here's another one for Garrett. Has the Dallas Fed looked at the implications for the offshore?
No, we have not. We assume that, given that it's entirely a federal issue, that we would see similar results as far as the production volumes go, although maybe not as immediate of a U-turn in production. The Gulf declines at a much, much slower rate than what we see in shale basins. So, that steepening treadmill that you hear about on shale production doesn't really apply to the Gulf. But, if we do see no new permits being issued, you would see a long-term and unstoppable decline in Gulf of Mexico production. It's just, our top-down view of it, but not something that we have, put pen to paper on like we did for the Permian.
The National Ocean Industry Association, NOIA, has an assessment of the impact offshore that folks could refer to.
Okay, here's one for Kathleen. The IER recently made the announcement that they don't think any new oil and gas leasing would be needed. Do you have any response to that?
Yeah, new leasing is needed because, well, there's interest already. There are expressions of interest and nominations out there for new leases. And it's because, again, well, there's not a basin in the West other than maybe the DJ Basin on the Front Range of Colorado that isn't predominated by federal lands. It's just in the West, oil and natural gas are on federal lands, much as we wish that weren't true. So right now we're at historic lows in leases. 26.2 million acres of leases are in effect. That's down 41% since the Obama administration. It's down 71% since 1985 when historic records began. So we're producing more on less acreage, but sometimes, you're even, again, you try to site those wells off of federal lands, but in doing that exploratory work, you realize I need some of these adjacent leases, or my well lateral is going to hit some federal lands and minerals, and you need a new lease. Otherwise that project can't go forward. So leasing can't just stop and then we just are done. We do need to move forward with leases, even though we do have leases in effect now.
One question, and either you can take this. What would be the impact of all this on greenhouse gas emissions? It strikes me as not much because the production will have to come from someplace else, maybe outside the US. Did any of you want to respond to that?
Yeah, we didn't, model emissions, and we kind of operate on the assumption that the upstream emissions from the oil and gas sector are very small compared to just the burning of the fuel itself once it becomes a product. So as far as the difference in the production outlooks here, I mean, in the Permian Basin, it's continuing to grow under either scenario. It's just a matter of, and we may be wrong on that, but that was what our scenario indicated, or scenarios indicated for the basin-wide impact. So the emissions would continue to increase. It's just a matter of how much, and even then, it's a marginal volume compared to the other the downstream impacts here.
I'm glad for that question, because you'll often hear from the Interior Department that they're justifying this ban on leasing because nearly a quarter of emissions of US greenhouse gas emissions come from federal extraction of oil and gas on federal lands. And they base that on a study by the US Geological Survey. Well, all I did was go into that study and add up the numbers, and it's actually 0.6% of emissions come from the extraction, and only 7% of US emissions come from the extraction to end consumer use. So nearly a quarter does not equal either 0.6% or 7%, at least as far as my math goes. So you're right, Ben. If we don't produce it on federal lands, it gets produced in Texas or elsewhere. And if it comes from overseas, it's certainly got a higher greenhouse gas profile than in the United States.
Okay, well, Garrett and Kathleen, thank you very much for joining us. We have a few moments left. Do either you want to make a few concluding remarks?
Not myself, no.
Okay, you've said it all. I just wanted to eliminate one piece of wishful thinking, which is that this doesn't matter because we're making a wholesale shift towards electrification. I would throw cold water on that. The reality is EVs are catching on, but they're still about 3% of the new vehicle market. It's entirely possible that we might be using a little less gasoline 10 years from now. It's very unlikely that we'll be using dramatically less. So the oil is going to have to come from somewhere. And if it comes from outside the United States, when more of it could have been produced here, that's a bad policy environmentally as well as economically. And with that, I did want to
Ben, I got to just say, hey, yeah, electrify, you'll need more natural gas. So we're okay with that too.
Well, thanks for adding that. Well, thanks again for joining us. I urge everyone who listened in to do a brief survey about today's conversation so we can try to improve these programs. And I hope you'll join us for our next event, Wednesday, June 9th. CEI President Kent Lastman will host a book forum with Jonathan Rausch on his upcoming book, The Constitution of Knowledge, A Defense of Truth, which is due out soon. And with that, thank you very much.
Thank you.